Is the day for the kin to shine. As a Warhammer 40k Votann player, I've been waiting for this day for a long time to be able to do a book review on a Leagues of Votann book, and I'm finally able to bring it to you guys today. I finished it just a few weeks ago, and it's been a lot of fun to get to know that lore. But there's a lot to talk about with this book. It's in an interesting place for me across the board, especially for Warhammer 40k novels. So let's take a minute and dive into it and talk about some of the background and what we learned from it. And then maybe we'll get to some criticism, stuff like that as the video goes on. But first, let's talk about the author and who he is and maybe why he got selected to write this story. Okay, everybody. So High Kahl's Oath by Gav Thorpe is what we're here to talk about today. It's the first ever book written for the Leagues of Votann. We've had a few short stories here and there, none of them actually giving us a lot of lore. So we haven't really had much to go on as far as Votann players and the aesthetic and feel and how armies work. And one of the things I really did like with High Kahl's Oath is it actually does give us a really good feel of what an army of Votann would look like. I should say an army of kin would look like. It was really, really interesting with the lore and giving us a good foundation of how the kin work and how all of the leagues work. It was really, really cool to see. But at first I was really surprised to see who wrote it until I actually started looking into Gav Thorpe a little bit more. Gav Thorpe is a former game developer and lore master for Games Workshop, who's been doing this for quite a while. He's a very successful author and is one of Games Workshop's favorites to tackle these stories that may be a little unique, or to ease in stories and cultures and factions into a more lore realm. He's got 124 stories currently inside the Warhammer 40k Black Library, which is a lot. I can't imagine it writing 124 stories in my lifetime. It takes me about a year to do one novel and a couple months for short stories. So hitting that number is a major career mark point for him. And he's had a lot of really good stories. He's really famous for his Dark Angels stories, as well as the more controversial Pathways of the Eldar, and as well as several of his other stories that fill in things like the Indominus Crusade and the Rise of the Inari. He's covered a lot of all of those stories that have been really good. Some have had some issues, but he's a staple when it comes to Warhammer 40k. So after looking into it a little bit more, I'm not surprised he was the one tapped for this book, but we're going to talk about some of the other things that came up that I think may have been a detractor. And to be clear, his writing style, his prose, everything like that fit the story very well. It was very well written mostly. It did have some issues, but we'll talk about that when we get to this next segment where we talk about the plot. The plot of the High Kahl's Oath is a pretty broad one. And honestly, that's one of my big issues with the story. It seemed to have 3 full arcs in it that really probably should have been a trilogy, not a single book. But it covers the story of Myrtin, who's a Kahl that is sent out on an expeditionary force to work to pay off her debts and to really acquire a lot of information and property and payment for her league. And during this time, she has run-ins with the Imperium as well as Chaos, and we get to see a little bit more of who she is and get to know her really well. At the end of this arc, we see that she gets a call from the hold ship, the kind of space fortress headquarters of her league, and she's being recalled back after a long time. It doesn't actually tell you how long she's been gone or how old she really is. It just denotes that she's one of the oldest of the Votann. And she's called back to become the High Kahl. Now, I'm going to leave out parts here to not make it too spoilerly. As the story progresses, we see her have run-ins with orcs and Chaos Space Marines, and a lot of things happen that put the entire League in jeopardy for something that's extremely important. I'm not going to go into details there because all of that is major spoilers that would pretty much ruin the entire story. Spoilerly, but for me, this section here easily could have been an entire novel. It would not have been hard to stretch this into 150,000 words and make it a good running story, because she has a run-in with the Imperium, which is very abrupt and cut short. There's a lot of places to improve relationships and dialogue. And honestly, it feels like Gav Thorpe went with a trilogy planned and then was told to condense it into a single book. And he had to cut a lot of really good stuff that he'd set up. And that's kind of the way it felt to me, is that it was a really good story that had been pared down too much. That being said, it's still a pretty good book. I'd probably rate it a 3.5 out of 5 stars, which isn't bad. In the Warhammer world, that's probably about average for books. There are a lot of really bad books, and there's some really good books as well. So 3.5 is probably about middle of the pack. So not a bad read, especially if you're a Votann player, but just be aware there's some pacing issues where things just kind of cut off abruptly, and there's not a lot of lead in, there's not a lot of time for foreshadowing. A lot of times you're getting it foreshadowed literally a chapter before it happens. So it does have some struggles, especially for me as an author. Those things stick out like a neon sign to me, and it probably bugged me a lot more than it would bug other people. But it's something to keep in mind. But let's just say the plot structure is really good. I said, if this were broken into 3 separate arcs, it would make complete sense. Where Mirthan's out on her expeditionary mission and gets called back at the end of the first book. The second book is the court politics and trying to grow into her station. And the third one is the mission she goes out on to try and save everyone. And those 3 stories, if they were broken into full-length novels, would have been fantastic. It was so close to a very, very good story. Like I said, it was just too condensed and too forced, which I honestly don't believe is on Gav Thorpe. So I wouldn't hate on him for that. It does really feel like it got pared down in editing. And that probably means Games Workshop went through and axed a bunch of stuff in the story and pared it down quite a bit to try and fit it into a single novel, which is unfortunate, because I think had it been allowed to be 3 books, you would have had absolute bangers of stories. That would have been your first, or Games Workshop's real first Xeno stories that would have been really, really good. You have a lot of decent Eldar stories, and I guess you do have the Infinite and Divine and the Silent Kings series. So it would be your second grouping of Xeno stories that would have been absolute bangers if it had been allowed to actually run its course. But unfortunately, that isn't how it worked. Now, there are some really good strengths to this book, which are some of the reasons I do like it. Your characters are really, really good. The characters are ones that you can get behind very quickly and you can enjoy. There's a couple different antagonists, both of which you will hate. You actually get a redemption arc for one of them, which is really good too. And on top of that, the Votann lore is amazing. I can't imagine having to be trusted as the person who has to create this lore from scratch, and all of the pressure that would be on you to make sure you build this lore out in a way that is a staple, something that people can hold on to and point to as the foundation of this faction. And Gav Thorpe does a very good job of this. He does a very good job of introducing everything from the collector aspect of Votann, where they collect trinkets from salvage, and then they display them, usually in their Great Hall, which actually causes a problem with the Imperium. But a lot of these little nuanced things are so cool. And as a Votann player and a fan of the Votann in general, I absolutely love this. It also gave really good structure and feel to how the army should work, which is why next week we're going to have a lore accurate army list based on this novel as well. Luckily, the army I play with was actually pretty close. I have one extra Einherjar unit than they did in the novels, but it was pretty close. And a lot of the little bits and pieces we've received in the past as Votann fans and players play pretty well into this as well. So I've gone through kind of my criticism already. So those are the strengths and negatives. Is to sum it up, really good characters, really good general plot. The author did a very, very good job with the narrative flow and the pacing as much as he had control of it. Now, the negatives are the negatives as well. You have a story that feels like it was kind of stripped and condensed into one novel when it should have been three. And some of the editing cut choices were a little weird. It had some major pacing issues because of the first two problems as well. So if you're looking for something fun to read and learn some new lore about the Votann, it's a great book. It's just not one that's going to be on my high-end Warhammer 40k novels. My bookshelves here are pretty limited, so my rules are unless it's a 5-star, I don't buy it. Most of the time. There's a few exceptions, but the vast majority of the novels I have behind me are the ones that hit that 5 stars for me and are absolutely ones that I will be obsessed with for a long time. This one is not one of those. It's good, they said, but I'm hoping it's setting the stage for what comes next. I'm hoping Games Workshop sees that this worked pretty well, and they're setting the stage for novels to run at the correct pace. I want a story like Gaunt's Ghost that's paced correctly and has all of the hallmarks of a good novel and a story that sucks you in. And unfortunately, this one couldn't do that. It kept breaking my focus and my attention on the story by time skipping where it was weird, or cutting off a conversation early, or breaking the trend and jumping way forward, or leaving out a chunk of space that should have been important. There's implied conversations that happen in between sections that really should have been in the novel, but we never really get to see them because it just doesn't show. And a lot of the dialogue is forced to try and move the plot along because it's so heavily condensed. So those are my thoughts on this as well. I know I'm a little bit tougher on this than I have been in a lot of the other Warhammer 40k novels, but this one is, like I said, kind of close to home for me. It's a novel I've been looking forward to for a very long time, and it didn't live up to my hopes, but it did at least its job. It wasn't a major flop, so that did make me happy. But for the kin, I will say it is approved. We like it. It's nice to have the lore, but it's not going to be a staple of the Black Library. So let me know down in the comments below what you guys think, if you've read the book, and if there's any other factions or novels you'd like me to cover in a book review as well. And make sure you join us next week for a lore-accurate Leagues of Votann list, which I am so excited about. I didn't think I'd be able to make this list probably until the end of 2025 or even later, until we got another codex and at least a little bit more lore to help us flush it out. But I hope you guys have enjoyed this, and don't forget to like and subscribe and ring that little bell so you get notified as soon as we have the next video coming out. and I will see you guys later.